This is lattice work worked as a filling. And here you'll notice that I've started to lay down some satin stitching. I'm using an untwisted silk thread. It's a Japanese silk. And you can see I've got 4 pieces of it together. This is kind of cranky thread to work with. So I would say it's more for intermediate embroiderers than beginning embroiderers. I'm going to be working a satin stitch across this square. And normally when you work a satin stitch you carry your thread across the back, but I'm going to cheat here and go from side to side to use less thread. The square has been stitched out already in a back stitch. Normally I think it would be better to use a stem stitch, but I wanted to mark the intervals of my lattice work, so I used the back stitch to mark those. Now, as I said, this thread is a little bit cranky, so you can see that it keeps itself kind of separated. It'll catch on any snag, so if you have hangnails or anything like that, you have to be careful. Or if your hands are even a little bit rough, it'll catch on them. And it helps now and then to run your needle just a little bit underneath it, or if you have a laying tool, to use a laying tool. I'm going to be stitching all the way across this square to fill it up. I won't show you the whole thing, it takes a little bit too long. So here I'm coming up just next to where I went down, and I'm going to pull out my threads a bit, put some tension on them so that they lay straighter. I'm going to run my needle underneath them, which is something you would do if you were using a laying tool. I'm not using one here. And then I'm going to keep the tension on it as I pull it through, and that helps keep it nice and smooth. Now I'm going to come up right next to where I went down. And take another stitch. And again, run my needle underneath those threads to straighten them out. Put a little tension on them. And go down there. Oops. My thread caught a little bit. Okay. So that's the filled square right here. It's about 1 inch, and now we're going to lay a diagonal thread in even intervals across the top of it. Here I'm using 1 strand of plain cotton floss, or DMC stranded cotton. So these are going to be laid in a diagonal, and I want to keep them as even as possible. It's easier because I'm using more or less a regular weave, so I can just count the spacing. But if you're using a plain weave, you want to eyeball that and make sure that your spaces are even between your diagonal stitches. You can also mark your fabric if you put little marks on the outside of where the design is, as long as it's an area that'll be covered, or as long as you can remove the marks. So here I am, just taking another diagonal stitch. I'm going to fill the top half of the square diagonally towards the top right, and then I'm going to work the other half towards the bottom left. So one more, and you want to keep a nice tension. Notice I'm not running the thread across the whole back of the pattern. I'm just after I go down here on the right hand side of the square, I'm going to come up on the right hand side of the square, and that way I'm not running my threads across the back. It reduces the amount of thread you use. It also reduces the build up on the back, or the chance of catching those threads on something else, because they're long and they'd be loose. So I'm just going to fill up this whole top part. Here we go. And it's taking a little while again because I'm counting those spaces to keep them nice and even. Lattice work can be worked on a plain ground. You don't have to do the satin stitching underneath, but it makes a nice contrast here for the sake of the video. So here I'm working the other diagonal, and I'm going to do it the same way. I'm going to work from the middle to the top left, then I'll come back and work from the middle to the lower right. And the second row, or the second level of stitches, is going to give you little diamond intersections all over the top of your satin stitching, which you're going to couch down in the last step. The silk that I'm using for the ground is by Yamoto Threads. It's Eterna silk. I like it. I usually use the Auvert Soie Oval, but this is nice, and it worked well for this little piece. The whole piece is only an inch square, so it's little. And now we finished the lattice work, or the lattice crisscross. We're going to couch down the intersections. I'm using 2 strands of regular stranded cotton. Actually, I think it's an overdyed cotton, so it'll change the hue a little bit through the couching. And you can couch different ways. You can go perpendicular, you can go vertical or horizontal. Here I'm going horizontal over these stitches, or you can even do both, but I'll just stick with horizontal. So you're just going to come up on the left side of your intersection, and then take your needle down on the right side of the intersection, just on the other side, to make a tiny little straight stitch right over the intersection, and this couches your threads in place, and it's also decorative. Of course, you could just use the same color, like the green stranded cotton, and oops, sorry, and the intersection or the couching wouldn't show up as clearly, but I like the contrast. You want to keep your tension pretty even. You don't want parts of your design sinking into that satin stitch, so keep your tension even. And here I am coming to the end of the couching. I think it's kind of pretty, the blue, the green, the red. And you just couch along the rows of intersections. So straight down one row, then come back on the next row, down the next row, row by row on the intersections. And then to finish the whole little square, I'm going to put a little decorative edge on it, and this is just a stem stitch that I'm working around the edge of the design. It's not really a design, the piece. There we go. Trying to keep my thread out of the way here. And that brings us to the end.